The frozen ground of eastern France cracked beneath the weight of military boots in December of 1944. And, somewhere, along a narrow road flanked by skeletal trees and the smoldering remains of what had once been a peaceful farming village, a young black woman from Montgomery, Alabama named Lillian Carter pressed her hands against a wounded soldier's chest, trying to stop the bleeding while German artillery shells screamed overhead and exploded in fountains of frozen earth and fire, and in that moment she understood with terrible clarity that the convoy she had been traveling with was not going to make it to the field hospital, and that the war she had crossed an ocean to fight had finally found her. She had been born in 1922 in a small, clapboard house on the wrong side of the railroad tracks where the summer heat hung thick as molasses, and the smell of magnolia blossoms mixed with the distant stench of the paper mill, and her mother had worked as a domestic for a white family on the hill, while her father had died in a factory accident when Lillian was only 7 years old, leaving behind nothing but a worn Bible and a photograph and a belief that his daughter was destined for something greater than the life that segregation had planned for her. Lillian had learned to read by candlelight, using borrowed books and newspapers that the white family had thrown away, and she had discovered in those pages a world beyond the boundaries of her small Alabama town, a world where people healed the sick and comforted the dying and made a difference that mattered. And by the time she was 16, she had decided that she would become a nurse, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. And there were many obstacles, because in 1938 there were only a handful of nursing schools in the entire country that would accept black students, and most hospitals would not hire black nurses to care for white patients. But what happened next changed everything, because Lillian applied to the Tuskegee Institute School of Nursing and was accepted, and for 3 years she learned the art and science of healing in an environment that nurtured her talents while preparing her for the harsh realities of a world that would judge her by the color of her skin before it would ever see the skill of her hands. And when she graduated in 1941 with honors, the Japanese had just attacked Pearl Harbor and America was going to war. The Army Nurse Corps was desperate for qualified nurses, but they were not desperate enough to set aside the racism that had infected every institution in American life. And Lillian was rejected 3 times before the mounting casualties in Europe and the Pacific forced the military to create segregated nursing units that would allow black women to serve. And in 1943, Lillian Carter received her orders to report to Fort Huachuca in Arizona, where she would train alongside 51 other black nurses who had answered their country's call, despite knowing that their country did not fully accept them as citizens. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because the training at Fort Huachuca was brutal and demeaning, with white officers who openly questioned whether black nurses could handle the pressures of combat medicine and facilities that were inferior to those provided to white nursing units. And through it all, Lillian kept her head down and her skills sharp, and she proved herself again and again until finally in the spring of 1944 she received orders to ship out to England as part of the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, one of the only all-black female units to serve overseas during the war. The crossing took 12 days on a cramped transport ship that pitched and rolled through submarine-infested waters, and Lillian spent most of those days in the ship's medical bay, treating soldiers for seasickness and anxiety and the 1,000 small injuries that come from putting too many bodies in too small a space. And when they finally docked in Liverpool, the gray English skies seemed to press down on them like a weight, and Lillian wondered if she would ever see the Alabama sun again. England was a revelation, because for the first time in her life, Lillian experienced what it felt like to walk into a pub or a shop without being told to use the back entrance, and the British people who had been bombed and rationed and pushed to the breaking point by years of war seemed genuinely grateful for the American nurses, regardless of their color. And Lillian made friends with local families and learned to drink tea with milk and sugar, and for a few months she almost forgot what it felt like to be treated as less than human. And then something no one expected, because in November of 1944, Lillian received emergency orders to join a medical convoy heading to the front lines in France, where the Battle of the Bulge was about to begin, and the army needed every nurse they could get. And so, on a cold December morning, she climbed into the back of a canvas-covered truck with 5 other nurses and a load of medical supplies, and they set off toward the sound of distant guns. The convoy was supposed to take 6 hours, but the roads were clogged with retreating soldiers and abandoned vehicles and refugees fleeing the German advance, and what should have been a straightforward journey became a nightmare of wrong turns and washed-out bridges, and by the time they reached the outskirts of the village of St. Vit, night had fallen and the temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and that was when the ambush came. The first shell hit the lead truck and sent it cartwheeling into a ditch in a ball of orange flame, and Lillian was thrown from her seat onto the frozen road, and for a moment she could not hear anything except a high-pitched ringing, and could not see anything except spots of light dancing across her vision. And then her training kicked in, and she was on her feet, running toward the burning vehicles, searching for survivors. Behind these ruins, a secret waited, because as Lillian pulled a wounded sergeant from the wreckage, she looked up to see German soldiers emerging from the tree line, their Feldgrau uniforms, almost invisible against the gray winter landscape, and their Mauser rifles pointed directly at her, and she understood in that moment that her war had taken a terrible turn, and that everything she had worked for and dreamed of and sacrificed for had led to this frozen road in a country far from home. The German patrol consisted of 12 men, led by a young lieutenant named Werner Hoffmann, who had been fighting on the Eastern Front for 2 years before being transferred to France, and had seen enough death and suffering to last several lifetimes. And when he approached the burning convoy and saw a black woman in an American nurse uniform kneeling beside a wounded soldier, he stopped and stared, because this was not what he had expected to find on this frozen December night. Lillian raised her hands slowly and said in the broken German she had learned from a textbook, "I am a nurse. I am treating the wounded." And Hoffmann looked at her with eyes that seemed to have seen too much, and then he looked at the wounded soldier at her feet and at the other bodies scattered around the burning trucks, and something shifted in his expression, something that Lillian would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because instead of executing the survivors on the spot, as many German units did in the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, Hoffmann ordered his men to help load the wounded into their transport trucks, and he personally oversaw the collection of medical supplies from the destroyed convoy. And when one of his soldiers protested that they should not be wasting resources on enemy prisoners, Hoffmann silenced him with a look that needed no translation. The drive to the German field hospital took 3 hours through roads that seemed to dissolve into mud and ice beneath the wheels, and Lillian sat in the back of the truck, surrounded by wounded Americans and German soldiers who watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, and she kept her hands busy checking bandages and monitoring vital signs, because if she stopped moving, she knew she would start thinking about everything she had lost and everyone she might never see again. The field hospital had been set up in a grand chateau that had belonged to a French aristocrat who had fled to Switzerland at the first sign of German occupation, and its high ceilings and crystal chandelier seemed obscenely out of place among the rows of bloody cots and the smell of gangrene and antiseptic. And Lillian was processed as a prisoner of war and assigned to a small room in the servants' quarters, and told that she would be expected to help treat the wounded regardless of which uniform they wore. The German doctors were initially skeptical of this black American nurse, but their skepticism faded quickly when they saw her work, because Lillian had skills that were in desperately short supply in the final months of the war, and she could suture wounds and set bones and administer anesthesia and keep dying men alive long enough for the doctors to get to them, and within days she had become an indispensable part of the medical staff, even though she was technically a prisoner. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because on her 5th night in the chateau, Lillian discovered something that would change everything when she was searching for clean bandages in a storage closet and heard voices coming from behind a locked door in the basement, and she pressed her ear against the cold wood and heard English being spoken in French, and she knew immediately that there were Allied prisoners being held somewhere below her feet. The lock was old, and Lillian was patient, and over the next 3 nights she worked at it with a hairpin and a small knife she had stolen from the kitchen, until finally on the 3rd night, the mechanism clicked open, and she found herself staring into a dark cellar where 19 gaunt faces stared back at her with a mixture of hope and fear. Among the prisoners was a French resistance fighter named Marie Dupont, who had been captured 3 weeks earlier while helping to smuggle down American pilots to safety, and Marie's left arm hung useless at her side, the result of a beating she had received during interrogation, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had stopped believing in rescue, but who was not yet ready to give up entirely. Marie told Lillian about the network of safe houses that stretched from the chateau to the Allied lines only 25 miles to the west, and about the codes and signals that would identify them as friends to the resistance fighters still operating in the area, and she told her about the patrol schedules and the weak points in the German defenses, and as Lillian listened, she began to formulate a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal, and possibly both. But what happened next changed everything, because Lieutenant Hoffmann had also noticed Lillian and he had begun visiting the medical ward at odd hours to watch her work and sometimes to talk with her about subjects that had nothing to do with medicine, and one night he sat across from her in the empty ward with a bottle of wine he had liberated from the chateau's cellar, and he asked her why she had come all this way to fight for a country that treated her as a second-class citizen. Lillian looked at this German officer who had shown her unexpected mercy, and she saw not a monster but a tired young man who was questioning everything he had been taught to believe, and she said, "I am not fighting for the country that exists. I am fighting for the country that could exist." And Hoffman was silent for a long moment, and then he said, "I used to believe that about Germany, and look where it has brought us." The weeks that followed were a delicate dance of deception and survival as Lillian gathered intelligence and smuggled food and medicine to the prisoners in the basement, while maintaining her facade as a compliant prisoner of war, and she memorized patrol routes and guard rotations and the location of every weapon and every vehicle in the compound. And she found an old radio in the attic that still worked, and she taught herself to send Morse code by practicing on a broken telegraph key she had found in the room. And then something no one expected, because on the 42nd day of her captivity, a massive Allied bombing raid struck a German supply depot 3 miles from the chateau, and in the chaos that followed, Lillian knew that her moment had come, and she moved through the compound like a ghost, unlocking the basement door and leading the 19 prisoners up through the servants' quarters and out through a drainage tunnel that Marie had told her about. The journey to Allied lines took 5 days and 4 nights through some of the most heavily patrolled territory unoccupied. France and Lillian led her group of survivors through frozen forests and across icy rivers and past German checkpoints where they could hear soldiers laughing and smoking just yards away, and she kept them alive by rationing the food she had stolen and treating the wounds that opened and festered in the cold, and telling them stories about Alabama and about her mother and about the life she was going to live when this war was finally over. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because on the 3rd day they stumbled upon a hidden resistance camp where a group of French fighters had been watching their progress and waiting to make contact, and these fighters provided them with warm clothes and hot food and guides who knew every safe path through the German lines. And suddenly the impossible seemed possible, and Lillian allowed herself to hope for the first time in weeks. The final crossing came on a frozen January morning when the group crested a small ridge and saw an American checkpoint in the valley below with the stars and stripes flying against a gray winter sky, and Lillian fell to her knees in the snow and wept because she had done it. She had survived captivity, and she had led 19 people to freedom, and she had proven that the human spirit could not be conquered by hatred or by war or by the chains of prejudice that had defined her entire life. But the story does not end there, because when Lillian was debriefed by military intelligence, they were astonished by the information she had gathered during her captivity, including detailed maps of German defensive positions and patrol schedules, and the locations of ammunition dumps and fuel depots. And her intelligence contributed directly to the success of several Allied operations in the final months of the war, and she was recommended for the Silver Star, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor in combat. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because the recommendation was quietly buried by senior officers who decided that the army was not ready to publicly honor a black woman as a war hero, and Lillian was instead given a letter of commendation and sent back to her nursing unit as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And when the war ended, she returned to Alabama to find that nothing had changed, and the same doors that had been closed to her before were still closed. The decades that followed were both ordinary and extraordinary, as Lillian worked as a nurse in segregated hospitals and raised a family and marched with the civil rights movement, and never once spoke publicly about what she had done in France, because she had learned early that there was no point in telling stories that people were not ready to hear, and besides, there were always more patients to treat and more battles to fight. The recognition came too late, as it so often does, when in 1997 a military historian named Dr. Patricia Williams discovered Lillian's file while researching the contributions of black servicewomen during World War II, and she spent 3 years fighting through bureaucratic resistance and official indifference to get Lillian the recognition she deserved. And finally, in 2001, at a ceremony at the Pentagon, Lillian Carter was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the 2nd highest military honor for valor. The citation read in part for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy nurse. Lillian Carter, distinguished herself by her unwavering courage, selfless dedication to the wounded, and her leadership in orchestrating the escape of 19 Allied prisoners from behind enemy lines. Her actions reflect great credit upon herself, the United States Army Nurse Corps, and the United States of America. And today, if you visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., you will find a display dedicated to Lillian Carter, including the compass she used to navigate to freedom and the nurse's kit she carried through 47 days of captivity, and the photograph of a young black woman in an army uniform looking directly into the camera with eyes that say, "I am here, I matter, I will not be forgotten." Because the truth is that history is full of stories like Lillian's, stories of courage and sacrifice that were buried because the heroes did not look the way society expected them to look. And every time we uncover one of these stories, we are reminded that the past is not as simple as we were taught, and that the people who built this country and fought for its ideals came in every color and from every walk of life. Lillian Carter died peacefully in her sleep on March 15, 1999, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and the story she had finally begun to tell in her final years. And her last words to her granddaughter were, "Tell them I was a nurse. Tell them I saved lives. Tell them I was an American." And that is exactly what we are doing here today. Her story reminds us that heroism is not about the medals or the headlines, but about the choices we make when no one is watching and the world is falling apart around us. And Lillian Carter made her choice on a frozen road in France, when she could have hidden or surrendered or given up, and instead she stood up and she said, "Let me save him." And in doing so, she saved 19 lives, and she saved something even more precious. She saved our faith in human goodness. So the next time you face an obstacle that seems insurmountable, or injustice that seems too great to fight, remember Lillian Carter, remember the nurse from Alabama who walked into the fire and came out the other side, carrying everyone she could, and ask yourself, what would Lillian do? And then do that, because that is how we honor her memory. And somewhere beyond the veil, Lillian Carter is still watching, still caring, still healing, because that is who she was, and that is who she will always be. The black nurse who refused to be invisible, the American hero who refused to be forgotten, the woman who looked into the face of hatred and answered with love, because in the end that is the most powerful weapon any of us will ever have.